So let me start off by saying that I'm not a professional YouTuber. I don't have any fancy equipment. I'm filming this on my phone. But I'm here because we need to talk about Alina Starkov. Specifically, we need to talk about Alina Starkov as portrayed by Jessie Mei Li in Netflix's Shadow and Bone. If you haven't watched Shadow and Bone on Netflix, you should go watch it, because this video will absolutely contain spoilers. You've been warned. Hi everyone, if you're watching, I'm Madison. I am based in Houston, Texas. I am a half Chinese and half German woman, and Jessie Mei Li is a half Chinese, half British actress. She happens to also be the lead in Netflix's new show, Shadow and Bone. Now, I was a fan of the books, so I was already looking forward to the show before it came out, but finding out about the casting really made it like I was 12 years old again. But better, because I never thought that I would see someone on screen one day who was somewhat like me. And yes, I did, in fact, get the movie tie-in version. I'm sorry to my old copy of Shadow and Bone. No, I'm not. But real talk, why did I feel the need to get this copy of Shadow and Bone? Well, the simple answer is representation. Why do I feel the need to keep talking about Alina Starkov, even though the show's been out for a month? Well, representation. Why do I feel the need to start a YouTube channel even though I'm not a YouTuber? Representation. After the show came out, I was feeling things that I never thought I would feel, and when I took to the internet to get more content, because I was so elated and hungry to stay in this world a little longer that I felt had been given to me as a gift, I found that I was not the only person who felt this way. I came across several cosplayers who, being mixed race Asian women themselves, incorporated traditions of their various cultures into their cosplays and incorporated traditional dress into their portrayals of Alina, and it touched me very greatly. I knew that I wanted to talk about Alina. I knew that I wanted to talk about what she meant to me, and on a whim, I reached out to one of these cosplayers and asked if she'd be interested in talking with me. Well, Mayan is amazing, and she has a crazy network that I do not have, and she has many skills that I do not have, and she reached out to several of her friends, and they all agreed to talk to me about this new heroine. And I'm happy to say that they are some of the most amazing women I have ever come across, and I'm so happy that you will get to meet them all here if you don't know them already. Now, just a disclaimer, I am not the only person on YouTube who has talked about representation in Shadow and Bone. If you are an avid YouTube surfer, you've probably come across It's Divya or Lady Genevieve or Shots by Sophia, and they all have some really great educational content, and I really recommend liking and subscribing and just hyping up all of their content, because I might have done that myself. I will link you in the description box down below to several of these women's videos, and I will also link you to some really great content on the Asian American experience, on representation in the media, and why it matters. And I will also link you to several charities that you can donate to, as this is the conclusion of AAPI Heritage Month. And I really appreciate all of you being here and taking the time to watch this video. Alright, so let's get into it. Also, when we filmed this Zoom meeting with all of us, it was on my computer, and my computer is so old. It's bad. Okay, so the lighting is terrible. It is terrible. I'm sorry. Hello, everybody. How is everyone? You look amazing, by the way. Okay, so we're here because we're going to talk about Alina, and I'm very excited. And so I'm sitting around and let everybody introduce themselves. I'm Madison, and I'm based in Houston, Texas. And I don't do cool stuff like these people do, so I'm going to let them go ahead.
I'm Katie. I am based in New England. I am a bookstagrammer, and I really like posting about own voices and diverse books. I also have a little Etsy store that specializes in cross-stitch book quotes. So that's my background. Mayan.
Hi, I'm Mayan. I'm from Ottawa, Canada. I'm mixed race, and I'm a cosplayer, so I mostly love cosplaying characters that I connect to. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm based in Southern California. I mostly cosplay, and I'm a sewist, so that's mostly what I post on social media. And am I missing anything? I feel like there's something else I need to say.
Hi, I'm Erica. Erica Alamode on social media. I am a cosplayer and a costumer and just a general enthusiast of books and stories. And I'm really excited to talk about Shadow and Bone.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm based in Washington State. I'm a cosplayer. I'm Cosmic Rays Cosplay on Instagram. And I'm also a full-time university student. So juggling that, I'm a Korean American transracial and international adoptee. And yeah, I'm just super excited to dive into the world of Shadow and Bone, the Grishaverse, and Alina.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm mixed French Vietnamese cosplayer and book lover. I was born and raised in New Caledonia, which is a French island in the Pacific. But now I'm living in New Zealand. Yeah, I loved Shadow and Bone, the show. I love the books, and that's why I'm here.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions, and I think we can just go around in the order that we did, so that way everyone can get to talk. So episode 1, lots of stuff happens. We get exposed to the racism that Alina faces from various people in her units and outside of it. She gets called several slurs. I did think the rice eater thing was kind of funny. We can get into that, but because there's not very much context for it. I once had a guy ask me what flavor of Asian that I am. It's just like, I don't know, man. It tastes like disappointment. So she's even denied food at one point for being Apshu, which is pretty intense. There's propaganda in one of the tents that she goes to that's very reminiscent of, World War II era anti-Japanese propaganda as well. But so relating to all of that, I'd like to ask each of you if you can pinpoint the first time when you realized that some people would treat you differently because of how you looked, and if you ever wanted to change anything about yourself as a result after that. I mean, it can be when you're young, it doesn't have to linger. I know sometimes they do, but because for me, I think it was when I was about 5, because growing up in a very diverse family, I knew we were Chinese and I knew we were German, but it wasn't something that we talked about that much. It was more of like what we did and who we were as opposed to how we looked. And then I got to school and, people started doing the I thing among other unpleasantries. So that was when I really was like, oh, this is different. But what about each of you?
I'm mixed race and I'm fairly white passing. So as a kid, I think I remember some kids doing the eye, making fun of the shape of my eyes. But for me, I felt like I got more targeted because I wore glasses and I had braces and I had acne, and that was sort of the focus of my childhood experiences. But I remember in college being told by some of my professors and some of my classmates that I would have more opportunities as an Asian actor or as a mixed race performer, that I should capitalize on that. And in college is where I first heard the idea that in order to succeed professionally, I should change my name to broadcast my Asianness. And so for me, it was less about my appearance, because I am more white passing, and more being told that I needed to broadcast my otherness in a more substantial fashion in order to get work. Which when you're 18 to 21 and you're already trying to figure out who you are as an adult, is a really complicated idea. I grew up in New England in a very not diverse community, so I've never had a super strong connection to that side of my identity growing up. So it felt foisted on me, actually. Like I felt like I was being forced to claim something. And it was more about how my name sounded than about how I looked, which is a little odd now that I think about it. But that's really the first moment that I was like, oh, there's something different about me that I can capitalize on, but also that could work against me in certain aspects of my life.
I think for me, the first time was in school. My school was generally very multicultural, but you always get those questions of like, what are you? What's your background? And sometimes it's with like a tone of judgment, of like othering you. And so that's like something I really relate to with what Alina goes through in the show, because like I'm constantly being asked, okay, so you're different, you look different, so what are you? And I can never just be, oh well, I'm Canadian just like you, or I'm a student or a colleague just like you. So that, and also that was usually a question from like white people, right? I wouldn't really get that from like other people in my school, but I'd also get those questions from like Chinese people, because I'm half Malaysian Chinese and I don't look like traditionally mainland Chinese. So I would get those questions, and then they would ask me if I speak Chinese, if I speak Mandarin or Cantonese, and I don't. So that's another thing that made me feel different, because I don't connect to that part because I don't speak it. So I get comments of, you're not Asian enough because you don't speak the language, or you don't really look mainland Chinese. So
I had much the same experience as Katie, where people would ask, oh, well, your name is kind of like flat, kind of white sounding. And like, because you're not all white, you should change it to your middle name, which is just Polynesian. And, you'll get more attention. You'll get more gigs that way, because like people will remember you more. And like everyone always felt like they were being helpful. Like I never felt like it was being like pressed on me. I just thought it was a weird statement. And like everybody always felt like, oh, you know, it's such a dog eat dog world. Like you gotta like be memorable. And like one of the ways to do that is your name. And it's like, okay, I get that. But like, also I don't go by my middle name. I go by my first name. And then like, there were always like the off comments from my white grandmother. Every once in a while, she would make a comment about how like, we were brown kids. And again, she never meant it negatively, but like those comments were there. And then there were comments from girls in my Polynesian dance classes of like, oh, me and my sister were like the lightest girls there. And so I've mentioned this a couple of times to a couple of people, but all of my sketches growing up, I always drew myself with brown eyes and brown hair because my sense of what was beautiful was them, and I was the outsider because I didn't have black hair and brown eyes. And then as I got older, as I started to get into musical theater and stuff, it changed, and I started to draw myself lighter skinned, and then was fine with my lighter brown hair and green eyes. Yeah, it's interesting how it changes as you change where you are in life.
That does remind me, I had a very similar experience because my mother's side is German, so they have these really, really beautiful blue eyes. And for a very long time, I had this weird kind of mix of beauty standards. I was like, okay, well, I would be pretty if I looked more traditionally East Asian, like some of my aunts, but I had blue eyes. And so the thing in episode 3 where some of the maids want Jenya to make Alina's eyes less chew and she says don't, really gut punched me because I was like, I think a younger me, like 14 or younger, might have let her. Because it took me a while to kind of grow into that and be like, this is an okay thing to have.
I kind of had the inverse experience. I more similar to what Madison was just saying. I growing up when I was little, I spent the majority of my time between California and Hawaii, which is a much more ethnically diverse place. And so I never felt self-conscious when I was really little, because everybody looked so different and diversity was a thing that people just accepted. But when I started going to school in California, I was going to a primarily white school. I was one of 2 Asian kids, and people made sure that I was aware of that. And it was really uncomfortable because people would do the eye thing, or like, why is your nose so flat? Or like, does the brown come off when you wash it? Like, are you just unclean? Because like, as a light-skinned Asian, I'm still darker than a lot of the white kids that I went to school with. And so it was an odd experience because I had never thought of myself as different until other people made me aware of it. And it made Alina's experiences in the show seem so hard hitting for me to see her going through these things that I went through, like these people who are like, why are you the way that you are? Why are you here and being this? And it's like, well, this is just who I am, and you don't get to change me no matter how much who I am makes you uncomfortable.
As an adoptee, I would say what I can relate to most from Alina is like kind of understanding difference from the start. I was adopted into an all-white family although, you know, a lot of people want to characterize Washington State as like very diverse and liberal. I was raised in a rural part of it. And so there was like basically as old as I can like have memories, you know, like 2, 3, whatever, there's a sense of like everyone around me is white and I'm just there. And I think along with adoption, which I didn't know at the time, but I can kind of conceptualize now, is the idea of like really the white saviorism complex around it all, of like, you're lucky that you know, are no longer like orphaned like Alina was. Like there's a sense of like, you should be grateful that you're here in this space, even if you are othered constantly and you're very much aware of that. And I think there's also a sense of really recognizing as I got a little bit older, like, you know, into like 5, 6 school age, of like, you know, all of my accomplishments meaning nothing over the fact that I was different, that I was Asian, and that might be something more people can relate to. And so in the same way, like Alina being a cartographer, like she's contributing to the First Army, like, you know, she's and she's trying to make that, you know, like her, like make friends there and truly like contribute to the war effort for Ravka. But at the same time, what she's going to be judged by ultimately is her shoe features, like before anything else. And so that to me is kind of like what really would like resonate with me. And then also her and Mal status is like orphans and stuff. And so for me, like that's kind of where I could connect to that. So
I'm sorry you had to go through that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Growing up in New Caledonia, which is a very small island with a very long history of immigration from different parts of the world, I think my experience might have been very different from everyone else, because pretty much everyone is a little bit mixed in some way or another. But I think the first time I realized I would be treated sort of differently, I was quite young, but I was at an age where I could understand where it was coming from. But yeah, it was the little comments about my appearance, and I remember this conversation. I probably was around 9 or 10, maybe younger than that. I was with my dad at a dinner with his friends, and this guy, I presume was French from France, started making comment about my face, that he could tell I was Vietnamese because of the shape of my nose, which when I think about it is absolutely absurd. But yeah, so I think from that time I got myself wishing that I could change my nose, and I wish I had my dad's nose, which he has beautiful long straight nose and very sharp face bones, and I have a round face. And yeah, I think from that time I wish I could change those things from myself, which is sad when you are very young to wish those things. But yeah, also at school, kids are violent in the sense that they would say things like, call me Moonface because my face is round, and yeah, call me Moonface, or call me we have this thing back home, it's pretty much like Ching Chong, but it's along those lines. But yeah, mockery from kids, but it shows how deeply those things are normalized, which it shouldn't. But yeah.
For my next question, I'm going to talk about episode 3 a little bit, because the entire episode has a lot to do with belonging and Alina feeling like she doesn't really fit in anywhere, because so many people in that episode, from the queen to Bagra, are asking her, like, what are you, where do you fit in? And she's like, I don't know. And I think a lot of us can kind of relate to that, being mixed race kids or adoptees or other things. It's a hard thing to try to fit into one box, because I do remember growing up and some of the scantrons that they have you fill out or different questionnaires when you're a kid, and they want you to only pick one race before, like way before we had the biracial mixed race option. And I would struggle with it. I was like, okay, am I more white? Am I more Asian? Am I more like, but my parents are these things, but so I think we should talk about racial imposter syndrome. So does anyone want to explain what that is to our audience, and just so that way we can talk about it a little bit more?
could maybe start us off and feel free to add anyone else, but I would say that racial imposter syndrome really centers around being someone who is between multiple cultures or identities, and the idea of like how you kind of position yourself within those like identities, or like your sense of self doesn't quite match exactly how people are necessarily treating you, or the world is like the traits and the treatment that the world is describing upon you. And so there's a sense of like this rift creating where you're not entirely sure like why there's a disconnect in that, why it doesn't seem to match your internal perception versus your external treatment. And with that becomes a sense of like you're between cultures or between belonging. You feel like, you know, an imposter within your own race, even though you are very much, you know, a part of that group. There's a sense of, well, I'm not, for in our case, like I'm not quote unquote Asian enough because I don't have maybe the cultural connection or the strong like sense of belonging to an Asian community, et cetera. And so in that way, racial imposter syndrome really manifests out of that like disparity, I would say.
I feel like I felt that more as a young adult than I did a child, because I think as a child I wasn't mature enough to like understand. I just figured anytime someone was, you know, for lack of better words, saying like, you're not one of us, without saying that entirely, it was just someone being mean or something like that. And that's like, as far as a child, I could take it. But as an adult, you know, especially how we live now, it does feel like some of the time, at least in California, it might be different in other places, it is kind of like choose a side. And I saw a meme post go by the other day, and I was like, I have to share it. I usually don't. I'm going to share this one. And it basically said, I have the right to not separate what I am, and it's not for your comfort. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. I do not have to separate anything. But it's been, I feel like in the last probably 5 years, it's definitely been pressed that like, yes, you have to separate them. And it's like, no, that I am what I am. Nobody else gets to press upon me that I have to separate myself. So yeah, for sure. I've definitely felt that. And it's a very bizarre feeling.
I think I felt racial imposter syndrome for a long time, but I just didn't know there was a specific word for it. But many times I felt like I didn't belong in my Vietnamese culture because I don't speak the language, I understand very little of it, I don't read it. And so when my mom and my grandmother talk to each other, I can understand a little bit, but not to the point where I can have a full-on conversation. And so when my grandmother relatives used to come around the house and talk to her, like they would ask me questions in Vietnamese and I wasn't able to respond because I couldn't understand. And yeah, many times I felt like I didn't belong in that culture because I knew very little of it. And I think most recently it became really hard living by myself in New Zealand without my mom and grandmother around me to surround me with the bits and bobs of culture. I felt very isolated, and even trying to reconnect with that part of me through the food and searching for clothing and stuff like that. I feel like I do not belong there. This is not mine when it is. And yeah, it's a weird feeling to be like sitting in between two chairs, really.
So on my Asian side, I'm like 4th generation Japanese. So there's a lot of like cultural space between the last time my family was in Japan and my grandparents and great grandparents were interned on the West Coast during World War II. So after that moment, their push to Americanize was really strong. So like, even though my grandparents were very likely bilingual, they did not raise my mom and her sisters to be bilingual. So there's just this huge gulf between my family and like the family history, even culturally. So like, not only do I feel just like identity wise how people look at me, I'm in this gray space, but I'm like, I have the question of how much right do I have to claim this Asian part of me, because culturally I'm so divorced from it. I often say jokingly, but it's kind of true, that the most Asian thing about me culturally is that New Year's Day is more important than New Year's Eve. And that's been like that was the big marker in my family. That was the big tradition, you know, New Year's Day meals. And the place that I've felt the most, pick one, is also is back to my theater career and trying to be an actor. When I was looking right out of college and I'd look at audition postings, I'd sit there and I'd agonize over whether or not I was allowed to go in for any role that was described as Asian. And then when I did go in, I straightened my hair. I like did up my eye makeup to really accentuate the shape of my eyes, and everything I could to make myself look more Asian. And then I would do the opposite when I would go to anything that was a non-specified role. Got to the point where I auditioned enough that I didn't care anymore. But then the roles I would get called back for were only roles that had Asian as a specifier, or the person of color casting. And you know, when you get into the callback room, you can tell they think they're being sneaky or that you won't be able to tell, but you look around and there's no white person there. And you're like, oh, we're the diversity cast role. We're the bit part that they decided they could afford to cast a person of color in. And in those rooms, I felt very not person of color-y. You know, like I would be like, you line me up with a line of white girls and I look pretty Asian, but you put me in a line of Asian women and I look pretty white. And so like that visual gray space was such a part of like trying to figure out how I wanted to exist professionally, that, you know, it affected me in a very specific way that it never affected me growing up.
I think I can relate a lot to that same thing, because my family has been in America for a really long time. I believe on my German side, they first came over in like the 1880s or something. It's been a long time. And then with my Cantonese Chinese side, it's been, I want to say at least my dad's grandpa, you know, so, but same thing. I grew up in Texas in a primarily white area. And usually I look very Asian compared to everybody else in that respect. So even now when I'm at work at my bookstore, like I'll be, you know, ringing someone's books up and then like they'll be like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I'm, you know, here, you know, my parents were born in Texas. And they're like, well, where are you from originally? And I'm like, I just told you. I'm sorry. I just told you. But it happens.
The where are you from game always drives me crazy. I am mixed race, but my Asian family lived in Hawaii for like a couple hundred years. So I'm somewhat disconnected culturally from that. I don't speak any of the languages. A lot of the traditions have been filtered through this Hawaiian culture of like mix and match Asianness that you get from the racial diversity that you have on the islands and stuff. And so my family lived there before it was part of the US. And so I'm not super connected to my Asianness, but physically I'm not white passing. And so people perceive me as more Asian than I perceive myself. I just perceive myself as a person, as the culmination of my cultures, but not the direct product of them. And so I think it has made people uncomfortable that I'm not Asian enough. Like people are like, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I'm from California. Where are you from? And I'm like, well, I was born in California, but like my family is from Hawaii. Like, where are you from? People can accept that I'm from Hawaii more than they can accept that I'm from California. It's always an interesting game. But when I lived abroad, my friends and my Asian friends and I would play this game. How many times can you avoid telling them what race you are before they finally crack and stop asking you where you from? How many froms can you get them to add before they finally crack and just ask you what race you are? And the thing is, if people asked me directly, like, oh, what's your like ethnic breakdown? Like, I would be totally fine answering them. But the fact that they would get so uncomfortable about my mere existence as a mixed human, it would just make them so awkward, and like they would dance around it. So I would just make them as uncomfortable as they were making me.
It is really funny, like you, because I'm the same way. If you just ask me if I'm Asian, then that's fine. You know, I'm not ashamed of the fact that I'm Asian. But when you ask somebody in that way, you're presuming that they must come from somewhere else. And they usually get very, very confused if you turn it around on them, especially if they're an old white guy or something. You're like, well, what about you? And they're like, Scotland. And you're like, it feels kind of weird.
See, I always get, okay, when I tell people like, oh, I'm from California and stuff, and then they get skeptical and stuff. I'm clearly mixed, and people just cannot figure out what the mix is, because I'm like Japanese, Chinese, but I'm also Portuguese, Spanish, Puerto Rican, Filipina, Pacific Islander. Like, we're a bunch of different things. I'm like a whole fruit salad of a person, and it really confuses people. And so I tell people initially, oh, I'm from California, because that's where I spent the majority of my life. People get really uncomfortable with that. And so, especially when people want to know where I'm from. And so they'll play this game, and I'll run them through like 13 of the where are you from questions. And finally I'll tell them, oh, well, I'm mostly Japanese. And so then I'm like, okay, well, then where are you from? And they're like, oh, well, I'm from Connecticut. And I'm like, where are you from? And then they're always like, no, I'm just from Connecticut. And I'm like, oh, well, I can't just be from California. Like, the fact that they perceive my Asianness as such a distinct part of my personality that I cannot possibly identify as Californian, but like white can be considered from anywhere, to me is just a little bit exasperating, because that is something that I've been confronted with a lot.
It's like they don't know what's the right question.
Like, being biracial or multiracial, like, you're not just one thing, you're several things, and you can also like identify with certain parts of your identity like more than others, and that can change throughout your life. Like for me, when I was younger, like I was more connected to my Chinese side. As I was growing up, like I lost that connection, especially because I was feeling like I wasn't Asian enough. You know, I don't speak the language and that kind of stuff. So like in my 20s that I realized like that uncomfortable feeling of not wanting to connect with that side, because I've always been told that I wasn't enough. It's not right to have to always be that way, and that your identity is like dictated by others' perceptions of you. So I recently read, or like last year, I read the Bill of Rights by of people with mixed heritage by Maria Ruth. And that's the one where it tells you, like, you know, I have the right to change how I identify, and I have the right to connect with one part of my identity like more than others. And I recommend everybody to read that rights, because it's so poignant. It's really comforting to read as a mixed race person.
Part of what Alina goes through that really resonated with me is right along the lines of what Erica was sharing about this. Like, she only refers to herself as Ravkin.
Yeah.
For her, she's never anything more than Ravkin. But for everyone else, she's part shoe. She's the shoe girl. She's half shoe. And like that disparity of like, everyone else can be from Ravka. I mean, Zoya can't be from Ravka, but you know, all of these other people can. But for whatever reason, even though she's grown up there, she's not allowed to be from there. And I think that was a really strong part of like the mixed race experience that I've had, that I saw reflected in what Alina goes through.
Yeah, I would say that I think for me there's a sense of especially because she can't go to Shuhan and like be accepted, because she is Rapkin, and I feel like for me the same way, like I don't even know, like, I couldn't tell you what like town, city, etc. I was born. Like the paperwork for adoptees sometimes gets really like messed up, and or the biological mother doesn't want to be found later potentially, so they make the records really spotty. So that's like my case. Like I don't know my biological mother's name. I don't even know, like I could tell you the generic province where they claim I was born, but I don't actually know. And so there's a lot, like, so there's like the mystery of that. But on top of that, the idea of like, Alina couldn't go back to Shuhan and like survive, quite frankly. And in the same way, like I feel like I couldn't go back to Korea. A lot of us couldn't maybe go back to like our, nationality, country of our countries where we have heritage, and like, and even, begin to fit in or understand like that experience, or, assimilate into that. And so it's like truly like we are just like American, Asian American, AAPI, et cetera. But there's a sense of like, yeah, we'll never be viewed as anything but that. And we don't get any agency over that decision, because it's the defaulted way of, the white invisibility othering us, and just like in giving and like slapping that label on us, and we don't get any choice in that. And so I think for Alina as a character, that really kind of resonated with me, and I feel like it's really important to show that she doesn't get control over that per se, which is, and it's framed kind of as wrong as well. Like it's framed as uncomfortable for her, clearly. And I think that's something that doesn't always get portrayed in media when that happens. It doesn't get that kind of weight or emphasis. So I think I really appreciated that. Yeah.
I like that she never, like, I feel like a really easy way out would be for her to like claim her shoeness, which is what I feel like the wider white community always wants me to do, right? They're like, I want you to claim that you're Japanese. I'm like, well, I'm claiming that I'm both. And the idea that it would have been easier for many people in Ravka for her to walk around in traditional shoe dress, whatever that looked like, versus a kefta, was, I think, a really subtle thing to do. And to have she just know, some of the criticism I saw about the racism was that there was nothing that marked Alina as culturally different. But I'm like, well, that's the point. She's not culturally different, even though everyone expects her to be. And that was, again, so much of my Asian diaspora experience.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really related to with Alina's story is how much her shoe identity was the only thing that people saw in her. They saw it as like a dominant part of her personality. And like she just identifies as Ravkin, and I just identify as American because my family has been here for so long that I can't just hop. I've actually never been to Japan. I can't hop over there and just fit in like everything's normal, like my ancestors did hundreds of years ago. I can't just like tap into my mystical Asian powers and just like melt into the landscape or something. I don't speak the language. Culturally, I'm not very Japanese. I'm loud and gregarious, and I laugh too loudly in public spaces. And so it's not something that I identify with, but it's something that other people see me and immediately assume that that's a huge part of who I am. And so one of the things that I really respected about her struggle with identity was when people kept asking her, like, who are you? What are you? And stuff. And then Alexander, when she's meeting the queen, just says she's Alina Starkov, like she's just a person, and she is who she is. And the queen's like, oh, well, I guess she's shoe enough. And he's like, she's just Alina. And that to me was something that, like, I never got that recognition from white people. I literally had a white guy tell me, oh, well, you can't be American because you're Asian. And I'm like, what is that supposed to mean? Like, Americans can only be white? And so to have a white character recognize that just because she's shoe doesn't mean that defines her personality, and that she has to explain who she is because of her race, I thought was a really interesting thing that made me like him as a character more.
I suppose he's moderately attractive, but I hadn't really noticed.
There are lots of little points like that where I think you can very clearly see Christina Strain was one of the writers for the show, and she herself is, I believe she's half Korean. She has a Twitter thread that I'll find later, but where she talks about the fact that a lot of Alina's experiences were things that she went through herself. And I think you can tell, because there's some points where I'm like, they had to have a diverse team of writers or some mixed race writers in the room to get these things. Like the fact that, as you said, with the queen, and she also assumes that Alina can speak Shu, and she can't. And then later on, Jesper is actually the person that is able to pinpoint that Alina is half Shu because he's also mixed race. I mean, like there's some things that I'm like, I don't know if someone who wasn't mixed race would get all of that in there they were writing. So it was very, very nice to see. I mean, I know some people think that racism doesn't necessarily have to be included in a fantasy show. However, we are in a war in the context of the story. And also, for me at least, it was very cathartic at the same time. Maybe because we haven't had enough mixed race main characters like Alina yet, but being able to see a heroine go through a lot of the same things that I had gone through, it was very heartwarming to me. So even though some of the subject matter was difficult.
And even if some people think that like the racism that's portrayed is like inaccurate or is inappropriate, like even then, the fact that there is racism in this show, it's creating conversation. And I also feel like it's a step in the right direction because like had we done blind casting, I would have felt like once again my mixed race representation is being taken away. Like we're just casting a person for a look and not for struggles and the identities like that the person actually goes through. So I appreciated that they made an effort to actually show that in the show and try to make it like a little more realistic.
What I loved about Alina is that what they did for her in the show is that her race, her identity is wholly part of her. They didn't cast a face and a look just for diversity points. Like they added this layer to her story, and it totally makes sense in the world of Shadow and Bone. I get that sometimes the racism she faced can be very jarring at times and very painful to watch, but it's so true, and I think a lot of us can recognize part of it in the show and can identify with it and find strength within her struggle to navigate her world. I think, yeah, they did a great thing about including that in the show. For sure, in one season, you cannot display the whole journey through accepting yourself and like rising above the struggles. Because yes, in the first season, it felt like she's only living through struggles, which is partly true, but our whole experience and our whole life is not defined by struggles. Like we have happiness and successes and things to celebrate. So hopefully in the next season, if there are any next seasons, that they will display more of her happiness and successes in finding herself and finding her identity, exploring the Shu part of herself. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for the next season.
The fact that they integrated racism into Alina's experience was really validating, because people who look like us don't typically exist in fantasy worlds. Actually, it's pretty clear how unwelcome we are in fantasy worlds. Like you watch Lord of the Rings and you see like the only Asian style people are the like Middle Eastern-esque barbarians who are marching on Gondor with their massive elephants and stuff. And you just see how fantasy worlds perceive people like us. We are the yellow peril, the other, the scary thing that exists in the world with its barbarism and so seeing Alina go through this world where she is herself, she's just also part Asian, and that also impacts her story. Like, our stories are not defined by our race. We are not living every moment defined by race and racism. We have interests, we have hobbies, we have likes and dislikes, we have days where we're not even interested in thinking about racism because we just have other things going on. We're full humans, but our experiences in the world are impacted by race and racism because of the way that other people perceive us and because of the way that we perceive ourselves. And so to see that she can still be this character who exists in a world to do something that's not directly about racism. She's not defined by her race or by her experiences with racism, but they're still a part of who she is and how she experiences the world, which to me felt very relatable because I am an active anti-racist advocate, but I'm also not defined entirely. My existence is not 24/7 anti-racism slash racism slash how do I experience race, but it is still a part of my experience in the world. It is a part of how other people will interact with me, and it's part of how I portray myself too. And so I liked seeing that she could have those experiences, and yet the story doesn't have to be defined by that.
I also really appreciated that it wasn't an Asian-inspired fantasy. I love those books. I love Own Voices books and getting these worlds where everyone is Asian coded, but there is something, I'm not only Asian coded. I mean, I grew up in the Western part of the world, so seeing someone exist in a fantasy world that is thoroughly inspired by Western fantasy tropes and experience this racism was really very different and very unique than like R.F. Kuang's The Poppy Wars, which is a great book and has wonderful representation in it. But that's I still have to go to Google and like figure out some of the things that are going on culturally there because I didn't grow up in that setting. So really having this main character who looks like me and feels like me and experiences those things in a world I recognize is also incredibly validating.
Yeah, I like that she can exist in a world that's not defined by Asianness, because I think a lot of people perceive people of color as existing only in the cultural context of your race. Like, they'll see us and assume that we are super Asian. Like, I live in a pagoda wearing kimonos every other day. But I live in a suburban California neighborhood. 9 times out of 10, I'm wearing a jumper because I've realized that having a one-piece outfit where my pants are attached to my shirt minimizes the number of choices I have to make in a day. And so we exist in these contexts that are not super Asian all the time. We're not always, praying at a Buddha altar every day. Like, some of us just go to church. Some of us just go to Safeway. I worship at the altar of food. And so we exist in these contexts that are not exclusively Asian. So I liked seeing an Asian character in a regular fantasy world.
Yeah. Going off of that, because I think it ties in, let's talk about representation in the media, because I think for a while, a lot of us didn't have a lot of representation growing up, or at least we couldn't relate to a lot of characters in the same way that we can with Alina, because I can remember a few very Asian characters, but when I try to pinpoint mixed race characters, I come up blank a lot of the times. And I think too, a lot of us learned to project onto characters that weren't necessarily like us, because that's often what happens with minority groups. You see a superhero on screen that is not your race, that doesn't look like you. And you're like, well, okay, but I can be brave like that. Or, growing up, I had Hermione, I had Katniss. I knew I didn't look like them. I knew they weren't me. But I was like, well, I'm book smart. I can be resilient. I can be these things. And you learn to do that for a very long time because you're not used to seeing yourself on screen in a role that is as prominent and as revered as some of those other roles. So I'd like to ask each of you, what are some examples of representation that you had growing up that were good and some that you kind of could have lived without? So
the only ones I was like up at like 6 o'clock this morning going, oh, that's the hardest question out of all these. I was sitting there like going through like my catalog of like, what did I watch when I was younger? And like, the only one I can really think of was Lilo and Stitch. I loved Nani. I loved that like she's this 18-year-old girl. Like as a little kid, you see her as an adult, but then as an adult, you see her and you're like, oh my gosh, you're essentially a child. You're essentially a child raising your only a little bit over infant or toddler sister, and now you have an alien as a pet. Like, you know, it's obviously a crazy setup, but like that was like really the only thing. I mean, beyond like Mulan, you know, like that was it. It was just like, now granted, I was a Disney Channel kid, so that's what I had. But more recently, like it's been more of like a recent thing for me that I've been like, well, I think because it was pointed out to me so much when I was younger that like, oh, well, you're mixed. You're not even like either. You're not even all white. You're not even all Asian. You're just mixed. I just kind of like grew up with the mindset that I was never, ever going to see anybody that was mixed enough to be like, hey, you're mixed. So I was just kind of like, the whole idea of like having worth because you see yourself somewhere else, I just like condemned myself to never seeing it. And like, how could I ever see it? I would have to do it myself, basically. And then my boyfriend had me watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Chloe Bennett is the lead, or one of the leads rather. And I was like, oh, I get it. I 100% get it. She had the whole thing with her name change. She, you know, was so outspoken about being mixed and having essentially the same thing happen, choose, essentially. And for the longest time, I was like, I don't get it. Why does everybody care if they see themselves in media? And then as soon as I saw her in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I was like, I get it now. Now I understand. But yeah, and then Sagwa on PBS. That was, I had to relate to a little cat.
That was a cute cat, though.
It's an adorable cat. Her and all her cat siblings love that cat. But like nobody knows what I'm talking about. They're like, Sagwa, what the heck is that? I'm like, oh, you have to go see the cutest cat.
Yeah, I mean, because I think for a lot of us, I mean, I don't know what the first one everyone else saw, but I mean, it was Mulan for the longest time. And then I got a little older and there was Brenda Song on Disney Channel. And when she was actually very non-stereotypical in a lot of ways, which was kind of great. And then Cho Chang and Harry Potter. And I didn't even realize what was wrong with that until I got older. And it was like, this makes me uncomfortable. But I wish I had so many of the more recent additions to like the representation media that we have now, because growing up, I would have loved, you know, To All the Boys and Alina and the things that we've gotten so far. So I just hope that they keep making more of them. But yeah, going back into everybody else's.
I think growing up, the only good representation of Asianness I had was through Mulan. But yeah, I mean, she's Asian and she sort of looked like me, but I couldn't recognize myself through her. And only very recently, through Raya. So I mean, from the time of Mulan and now with Raya, how many years it has been. And only now with Raya, I feel represented through Raya and through Namari and the food they display, the texture and the colors and the shapes in the movie. It's really evocative of Vietnamese culture, so I felt represented in Raya. But before that, apart from Mulan, I cannot remember a character that represented me, and so I think that's what Shadow and Bone with Alina did very well, because they are a mixed race actor. They are neurodivergent. They are gender non-conforming. All those level of representation are, I think, for me, are groundbreaking, because never before I've seen an actor and a character playing into all those things. So yeah, that's why Alina means so much. And that's why I relate a lot more to Alina in the show than in the books, because we didn't get that level of representation in the books. But in the show, that's something they did really great. And as for bad example of Asian representation, I think the main thing for me is that Asian characters are always, and that's the model minority stereotype that is so deeply ingrained in everything. They're always represented as either very smart, really good in science, math, stuff like that, or the physical appearance is really edgy, like edgy haircut with edgy colors, like as if all Asians are like that, like super edgy all the time, which is, I mean, it's a fashion style, but we're not all like that. So yeah, it's the little stereotypes like this that just don't make sense.
As a kid, I would have loved to have Alina, because like Alex said, I related mostly to Lilo and Stitch as a child. I did not really relate to Mulan at all, despite the fact that I am Chinese and people see me and assume that like Mulan would be my favorite princess. Personality wise, I'm more of a Belle. I yell at people and I read a lot of books. And so that's like all of my BIPOC friends acknowledge that I'm a Belle personality. All of the white kids that I grew up with didn't understand why I didn't want to be Mulan when we played Disney princesses at recess. And so I think, like, had I had Alina, because I grew up on fantasy stories like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, and like same, like you said, Madison, I didn't recognize how problematic Cho was, because I was like, wow, an Asian exists in a fantasy world, like an Asian can be a love interest. I never had any concept of that. And I think a lot of the stories that people tell about Asian characters are always so defined by Asianness. It's always like the fresh off the boat stereotype, you know, that you're super culturally Asian, you're 100% Asian, you identify very Asianly. And that's not something that I really relate to, because my family's been here for so long. So seeing a mixed character who identifies with her Ravkin identity, not necessarily as heavily with Shu culture and stuff, like that's the kind of story that I wanted as a child, where like I could be included in a fantasy world and my mixedness could be acknowledged. So I thought that was really cool to see in Shadow and Bone.
The only one I can think of from my childhood that hasn't been mentioned is Trini, the original yellow Power Ranger, which, you know, the color association alone is problematic. And of course, that was the, whenever we played Power Rangers, I was never allowed to be Kimberly. I had to be Trini sort of idea. I really liked Mulan because I'm a tomboy. And so the sword fighting and all that like really fit with my parts of my identity. And then I was thinking about this in relation to something else, but the first time that I ever saw myself in a book, in 2 books, were Magnus Bane in the Shadowhunter Chronicles.
Yes.
Half demon and half Asian. And then Cinder, who is not actually written as Asian, but because she's in the Republic of China, she's has this coding of being Asian and cyborg, and it was their halfness, this like that they existed between these 2 worlds that I think I connected with more than the Asianness. And they were both written by white women, which, you know, has I have feelings about that. But like that, I read those when I was in my late 20s. So I went from, you know, like Mulan as a kid and then nothing. and not even trying to look for it because I just expected it not to exist. And then to start finding it. And like my reaction to seeing Jessie Mei Li as Alina was like, I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know she was going to be Asian. I like had it on pause and just was like staring at her face because I was like, oh, your eyes do something similar to mine, but your nose also does something similar to mine, and I can see the shape of my face in the shape of your face, and that had never happened with a mainstream actor before. And you know, that's at age 30, so 30 years of like not seeing yourself anywhere, and how powerful it is that first time is, even if it's not that length of time, it's powerful when you see it.
Definitely. I mean, I cried. I cried because I am 26, you know, not that much younger, and like I never thought I would see a YA heroine that was actually the type of mix that I am. Like, I just didn't expect it to happen, and I found out gradually over the process of like the press being released for the show, and I got super excited. I mean, especially because in addition, like, you know, with Jessie Mei Li, I'm like, oh, you know, we have the same last name, which is kind of weird, but like her dad is Cantonese Chinese and my dad is Cantonese Chinese, and like she has ADHD, I have ADHD. Like, little things really matter a lot sometimes.
I didn't realize I was missing it until I saw it. Like, I didn't realize I had never expected it until it was there and I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. I also thought it was really cool that Jessie Mei Li is gender non-conforming and goes by she, they pronouns, and like having someone who is like genderqueer leading or in a lead role of a huge fantasy series is like so important and so like groundbreaking to me, because like you never really see that. It's always the default is, you know, white and straight. Having someone who's like ticking those boxes for myself as a queer person and also a mixed race person is like so validating to see that.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool how they included this character who, wait, I'm totally blanking on my thought now. What was I? Where was I
Talking about
going?
Jessie Mei Li.
Yeah, I thought it was, oh God. You know what? Never mind. I have no idea.
Oh, yeah, we'll come back to it.
I mean, for me, representation wise, I would say growing up, really having it mainly in like Avatar: The Last Airbender, and obviously the, you know, Legend of Korra. But even then, I think like it was, you know, it's not perfect, and just like, you know, it was written, you know, it's two white men who are, you know, in you know, using the show. They very much, you know, grab and take from cultures as they so please to kind of, you know, roughly translate each of the four bendy nations into some sort of culture. But even so, I think, I'll be completely honest, I don't feel like I've maybe even found my representation yet in anything. And I think there are things that have come close. I think Alina and Shadowbone has become the closest. And so that's why I celebrate it so much so. But I do think that, you know, this just means there has to be like more forward momentum towards even more, you know, obviously diversity of story and identity and experience. But I would say like, another thing too, I guess like for me, it's interesting because like I couldn't relate to Mulan actually as much as like maybe like I, you know, celebrate that as well. And just the sense that I feel like there was for the longest time this idea that like Asia was only China, I think. And I think we see things as Raya that are breaking through that, which is amazing. But I'm also not Southeast Asian. So I recognize like the importance of like, you know, not centering myself with that per se, but still, you know, obviously, yeah, recognizing that it's super important, a landmark production. And so I guess, yeah, we talked about, you know, Cho Chang and all of those other things, that there is a sense of like everything has been, you know, maybe not quite descriptively right or problematic in some way. And so that, but the fact that there is now just more, you know, examples of this Asian representation is so powerful and important at the same time. And so I guess for me, I'm still kind of torn because there is a sense of, especially with stories that either center, yes, on either China or Japanese culture, which I know like Korea has a complicated history with Japan and its you know, like occupation and whatnot. So for me, anime was kind of off the table in a lot of ways because it does come from that perspective, especially like Attack on Titan is a total mess, but in that sense with the imperial undertones. But yeah, I don't know. I think for me, it's one of those things where it's like, yes, looking at like, you know, fantasy worlds that, you know, are more like quote unquote traditional in their Eurocentricity, and having Alina as an Asian like woman, and also, you know, Jessie Mei Li bringing in her or their own queerness, is very important. But I think also for me personally, just kind of to string together the entire representational like journey for me personally, there's a sense of like, great, what's next? Like there's 100% that's like, I'm on board for this, but I think there, you know, there has to be an increased diversity, because I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel like there's still a like prevalent theme, I feel like in you know, in cinema, Hollywood, the media industry, in literature as well, where a character is either fully Asian and they have to be, like we've talked about, steeped in their culture and their mysticism and all of the stereotypes, and or there's a sense of like, having mixed characters super important, but also there's a sense of like, there's some way that having that mixedness or some connection to whiteness makes them like allowed to be into more of like, you know, into the world that is then predominantly white. And so there's a sense of like, there's a redeemability there. And so I'm really kind of waiting maybe for there to be a, you know, fully Asian you know, person in a Eurocentric or like a, you know, like not Far East centered, you know, world that does get center stage. But like I said, Alina is, you know, very much that in a lot of ways as well. So it's like, total celebration, but just a sense of like, what else? And so that's what I think with subsequent seasons of Shadow and Bone, it'd be really cool to see, because there are, you know, more Shu characters to potentially explore and dive into. So I think for that, I'm really excited. But yeah, I'd say for representation, it's one of those things. It's like an ongoing conversation, ongoing process, and I don't think it's complete by any means. So
That actually helped me remember my thought.
Cool.
Yeah, I think there's a level of palatability with being mixed white that other full Asians, or even mixed Asians plus other things like mixed Asian and Black, mixed Asian and Hispanic and stuff, there's a level of palatability being part white that makes you more acceptable to a white audience. People have literally told me in the past, oh, you're part white, that's
why you're so pretty.
Shut up.
No, it's not natural for someone to be as stupid as he is tall, and yet...
Oh, there you stand.
And I'm like, what an odd thing to say. Because I think our part whiteness makes us more acceptable to a Western audience. It makes our features a little less alien. It makes us just seem a little less other. So they're like, oh, well, she's Asian, but she's not so Asian that she offends me. And so they can accept me because I'm part white. And so I've developed this sense of skepticism towards my mixedness and other mixedness too, because I feel like how much is my mixedness making you more comfortable with my otherness? And so I think the thing that I loved seeing the mixed representation that we got with Alina, and I loved seeing Jessie Mei Li own their Asianness and their sort of Ravkin-ness too. I loved seeing how Jessie Mei Li as an actor owns their Chinese identity and their British identity. I thought that was really cool, because you can be both. You're not less of either thing, you're just both. And so I thought that was really cool. And I also like that they picked Jessie Mei Li, who is gender nonconforming and who also has ADHD. And I feel like there's a degree of palatability around your conformity. And so Asians are okay, but you have to be straight, you have to be neurotypical and stuff. You have to be palatable for people to accept you, because like I'm neurodivergent. I'm on the ACE spectrum and stuff. And so it makes people uncomfortable to acknowledge that I can exist in a space that's not just defined by how Asian I am. And so once I'm outside of other boxes, then I'm just too different. So I thought it was really cool to see them cast an Asian actor who is also a full person who doesn't fit in all of the other boxes and stuff and still gets to be part of this fantasy world and stuff. To me, that spoke towards like less of the palatability thing that I always see when people cast mixed Asians. So I thought that was really valuable.
Yeah, no, and when you're saying that, sorry, like sudden thought, I think the thing that makes us different and so important, as you've touched upon, but like there's narrative significance given to the fact that she is in fact like mixed. And I feel like I think all the time about like The Witcher choosing to cast a mixed race woman for Yennefer, and how that could have been a big like important point, but it wasn't. It was given no narrative explanation or significance, like just the sense of like, oh, we're being a diverse production because one of our leads is, you know, half, I believe, Indian or Pakistani. I'm not entirely sure. But the idea of it's like, okay, but then you're only really doing it for the aesthetic. You're not incorporating it into the story. It seems performative. It seems, you know, kind of offensive to really do that and not, you know, address it at all. And so I think that's what Shadow Bone does differently. And that's what production should be doing. They should be recognizing that, yeah, you can in fact be both. There is in fact power in that identity, and it shouldn't just be used for shallow production marketing reasons, which I think it happens far too often.
What Erica's saying on like the comfortable part of that, because it, as someone who does lean more onto the white passing side, you know, people I've known forever suddenly looking at me like squinting and being like, but like you're not like all white, so like what are you? And then the follow-up to me telling them going, oh, that's why you're so pretty. That's just kind of an awful statement. Like, that's such a thank you. Like, you're left with this like uncomfortable, like, so you're saying that like, if I had been all white, then I wouldn't have been pretty? Or are you saying that if I had been all Asian, you wouldn't have been comfortable?
I consider us like the black pepper of a meal, you know? We're a little bit spicy, we make your food more fun, but we're not too spicy that you can't eat it. And so it really is a palatability thing, because if we're too Asian, then people find that offensive and they're like, oh no, I can't handle that. But you know, it's a little more exotic, a little more magical, a little more mystical Asian female.
I want to pause for a second to talk about the word exotic and why it might not be as big of a compliment as some people might think it is. And to do that, I'm going to be a bit of a nerd and get into the etymology. But exotic, at its heart, comes from the Latinization of a Greek word which means foreign or outside, which, when you think about it, really makes sense. An exoskeleton is a skeleton that is exo, or it is outside of the body. If you're exiting a building, you're going outside. So if we take a compliment that someone might give women like us, so, oh, you look so pretty, very exotic, and turn that on its head and insert the actual meaning of the word. Oh, you look so pretty, very foreign. Or, oh, you look so pretty, you don't look like you're from here. It sounds a lot less nice, doesn't it? And I know that when most people call me or my friends exotic, they are really trying to give you a compliment. They don't mean it in a mean way, but it just has a kind of icky factor that I think is actually best summed up by Leigh Bardugo in Six of Crows. And if you read this quote about the menagerie where the character of Inej is indentured, it's a brothel actually, that specializes in exotics, you can really see all of the undertones that the word often carries whenever it's used by some guy in a dating app or someone that just comes up to you and says it. Leigh makes a point of emphasizing that the people who come looking for these foreign women are often satisfying the need to look or indulge in some particular feature rather than the actual personality of each individual girl, and that's often where a lot of the creepiness comes in.
Just to have a little bit of something spicy thrown in there. And yeah, so that's my skepticism with that.
I think that whole palatability conversation is why people started to get really uncomfortable once the racism came in, because they were fine if she looked Asian, if Alina looked Asian. They were fine that Jessie is a biracial person, but the instant that that biracialness starts to taste bad or starts to make you uncomfortable, it was not okay. But they could accept a biracial person as this leading role as long as that character had no biracial experiences.
Yeah,
I just really appreciated the moments of tension between her and Zoya, and that it wasn't just light-skinned characters who were like throwing prejudices at Alina, because I feel like that's also a like something that happens in media where they pretend that only light-skinned people have racist tendencies and make assumptions about people. And so I thought that just the integration of almost so many different colored characters had different opinions about each other because of their backgrounds. Most clearly with Zoya, Zoya's baiting of Alina all the time. I thought that was a really subtle thing that to other people seems wrong and inaccurate and like an overstepping, where if you've been in those situations, you're like, no, the internalized racism is real, is so real. And you throw it back at other people so you don't feel it yourself. And it's a very real part of being a mixed race person.
I loved that about Zoya's character. I thought it was really cool how they depicted internalized racism and the competition that you see between ethnic groups, because I feel like a lot of the time ethnic groups are pitted against each other as a means for us to keep each other down so that white supremacy doesn't have as much work to do, because they don't have to keep us down if we can keep each other down. And I think we're taught to be in competition for white attention and white acceptance. And you can see how Zoya is competing directly with Alina for Kirigan's attention. And she feels like, well, it's a zero-sum game. If you're accepted, I won't be. And I feel like that's what we're taught as people of color. Like, if this other racial group gets progress, like, what about ours? What about us? If they're getting it, we're not getting it. And in reality, we are all facing the same issues, and it should not be a zero-sum game. We should all be striving for acceptance for each other and for ourselves. And it should be a collective effort, anti-racism. But I think a lot of the time, in order to prevent anti-racism, white supremacy has pitted us against each other. And so I thought seeing that portrayed in the story made Zoya a very interesting character, and it made her choice to, spoiler alert, to help Alina and to work against Kirigan in the final episode, it made that much more compelling, because you can see how much she wanted the acceptance, you can see how much she wanted the validation of the people around her, but she saw what was happening and realized, this is the wrong thing to do. I have to do the right thing here. And so it made her a more compelling character to see that she has this internalized self-hate that a lot of people of color feel and then turn on other people of color. To see her then choose, like, even though this is a really hard thing for me to do, to reject that acceptance, I need to do the right thing. I thought that made her a really compelling character.
And to add on to that, I think I've seen criticism about how there wasn't the racism specifically in the Grishaverse and the Shadow and Bones show isn't based on like anti-blackness per se, because we see like, we don't see as much mention, or at least like an explicit reference to the idea of like Zemeni people or Suli people. There are a couple of comments about Suli people, but this idea then of it's like, it's more centered on the idea like Ravka is at war with Shuhan and also the Fjerdans, but the idea then of like there's that like, there's ingrained xenophobia, xenophobia, and also just wartime conflict tensions that make, specifically the Shu a target of this and through Alina. And I would say to that criticism, I think that what it's really kind of saying is like, because obviously the fantasy world is, taking its liberties that make sense with its narrative and its history and its world building. So I have nothing wrong with that. And I also don't have anything wrong with them, with them centering Asian racism, because I think we as Asian people so often minimize our own racism, because the model minority myth persists in this world, and like Erica mentioned, the internalized racism of it all, and especially if we are, between cultures and identities of feeling like, do we deserve to claim oppression, because clearly it comes for us and it impacts our lives, but how much so do we get to like feel like we are valid in our victims and how we are victims of racism and system of oppression. So anyway, all of that to say that this idea of like there is a centering of anti-Asian racism and like the demonization of those specific features is kind of almost like a conversation that, like, for me as an Asian viewer, at first it did make me uncomfortable and feel like, why is this not racism centered or built on anti-Blackness or some other things that are more like prominent in our world? But at the same time, there's a sense of, this is just one narrative of many, and it's what it's doing is it's validating the fact that we do experience racism, and it is being highlighted in this show through the specific character, and it might expand, which would be great, and there's no problem with that. But for this moment, there is a sense of a validation that I think is super important for those of us who will often downplay, minimize, try to convince ourselves we aren't subject to it, when we really are, even if there's only maybe part of us that is that. But I don't know, for me, it was super validating in that sense. But at the same time, recognizing it is problematic because racism does not exist in a vacuum in this world. But in Ravka, it is centered around shoe discrimination. So I don't know, for me, that was super powerful, I think, to kind of analyze and go through that.
I think regarding the racism Asians deal with, and that a lot of people wrongly assume, is that we don't have it so bad. And that's part of the model minority, again, stereotype, that we are always excellent in everything, that we are, yes, we are working really hard all the time to strive, but like any other person, I guess. And so, yeah, I feel like people don't think we have it so bad compared to other minorities, which is not true. Like, we all have our own struggles, and we all trying to like do our best in this world despite everything. Yeah, that reminds me of that time as a kid. I was living in a social neighborhood, so like a lower class, middle class sort of neighborhood, and so my classmate had no idea, and I don't know why. Someday they realized that yes, I'm coming from the same neighborhood as you guys, and they were like, "Oh, but I thought you were rich, because you look wealthy," and I don't know. This is weird. Like, because I'm Asian, like, you assume that I'm rich, or I don't have, my family doesn't struggle as much. It's weird, but that's part of the racism we are facing, unfortunately.
I think that there's a history, especially in the United States and the rest of the world, but I'll speak to here, that the Asian experience is erased. Instances of racism against Asians are erased. They aren't covered as widely. They are erased from history books. And so everyone who called for equal racial prejudices against all people of color in the Grishaverse, I was like, so what you're saying is that the Asian racism experience isn't as important and doesn't deserve any kind of spotlighting in the same way. Like, I'm like, would you be having this conversation if Jesper was the center of the racism as a dark-skinned person? Would it be okay to never address the Asian racism? Probably, because how many movies have I watched about racism that have a dark-skinned person at their center, and if there's an Asian character, it's not a thing. And I really appreciated, like you, Elizabeth, the centering of that, and think that I don't want it to go away. I don't want it to be washed into just this like blanket prejudice that is somehow what people expect. And I think that it was great that they centered Alina in that. It's her story after all.
Yeah, I think this is not a comprehensive narrative of what racism is to all people at all times. this is a portrayal of anti-Asian racism, the same way that like Black Panther addresses anti-Black racism and the history of harms associated with that. Like that's one story. It's one narrative that depicts like one group's experience. This is a narrative that depicts our experiences. And so it may not speak to the racism that Black Americans experience. It may not speak to the racism that Hispanic Americans experience, but it's a valid story because it's the racism that we experience, especially with the fetishization and the alienation and the yellow peril terror that you see in the propaganda and stuff. Like those are things that we experience very poignantly. And so this is our narrative. And just because it doesn't speak to everyone's narrative doesn't make it less important. In the same way that like the racism discussed in Black Panther is not less important because it doesn't address the racism that we experience. We can still watch that and go, this is a very compelling story. It's just because it doesn't portray everyone's experiences, which I would argue is actually impossible because everyone's experiences are so unique. Just because it doesn't portray all of those experiences doesn't make it less valid. And so like, this is our story. And that's worth telling. Just because people perceive us as the model minority doesn't mean that we don't experience racism.
Also, oh, you have to go? All right. Well,
Thank you. Yeah, it was lovely to talk to and meet you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, because it is AAPI Heritage Month right now, and it's important to discuss in light of all of the events that have been going on the last year, like I think it has also forced people to see that anti-Asian racism is a thing. Like it's been on the news to the point where like it's kind of impossible to ignore at this point, or you have to make an effort to ignore it. And I felt like Shadow and Bone was released at the right time for that reason. It was like this is when we need a show like this.
They filmed this before the pandemic happened, but since then, hate crimes against Asians have skyrocketed. And to be fair, there were hate crimes against us before, people just weren't listening. But now people are finally paying attention to the racism that Asians face. And so I think that this story came out at a good time to sort of show people the validity of that experience and how even these like microaggressive things where like the chef just wouldn't serve her because she's Asian, and the queen couldn't perceive her to be Ravkin. She was like, oh, well, I guess she's Shu enough. Just tell her good morning in her language or whatever. And so I thought that this came at the right time to show people a fuller depiction of the Asian experience.
But that it also goes on to like, it's not like the funny thing is, it's like for those people who at the same time would say like, well, there's not like enough like exploration of racism of other groups or whatnot, or even of like Asian racism because it's solely through like Alina's experience. It's like, but that's not like, the show is still like a fantasy show with a plot. And so seeing at this time in this real world situation of, Asian hate crimes on the rise and stuff like that, that we also, as through, characters like Alina can demonstrate resilience to that, can demonstrate growth, can demonstrate triumph in being the hero of a story, in being important to that story, being central to that story. She is the sun summoner. Like there's really a sense of like, all of that matters and it's given its its dues, absolutely, as it should be, and it's very refreshing. But it's like the story is more than that, obviously. It's there's a heist plot, there's this kind of coming of age plot, there's this exploration of power and relationship dynamics and everything like that. And for me that was like the important part of like, this was not just like, we're in this time where we need to, where we have the spotlight is on Asian discrimination and racism. So therefore we're going to make a show about Asian discrimination, racism, which would be appreciated, but it's also like, no, it's more than that. And Alina is more than that. And that to me is what I think that was the part that I think made me cry more than any maybe like individual experience, was just like taking it all in, like finishing the first season and just sitting back and kind of recognizing like this full circle. Like it was, it was depth. There was narrative depth that was not in anything else I think I've ever seen, that acknowledged both the racism and the struggle and the triumph and the power of, people who can look like us.
That was very well said.
I feel like narratively, like Alina isn't in a place to like fully accept herself yet. So like I understand why they didn't fully, you know, close the circle of her like racial identity and her like struggles with it. So like you said, like future seasons they have plenty of space to get interactions with like characters like Toya and Tamar, and for them to talk about like what true culture is and like expand on it. But like we only had 8 episodes. What they did so far like gave a good big picture of what the racism is in Ravka. Yeah, I'm just like looking forward to whatever they do in the future seasons because I know that they're listening to our like criticism slash like approval and how it is very validating to see them just even show this part of Alina is yeah, it's important.
All right. Well, we're going to try to wrap up here in a few minutes, but before we do, I have a brief shout out to Milo the Goat because it is also Mental Health Awareness Month, so we got to, you know, give our therapy goat some credit. And then also, I know a few of you have incorporated traditional dress into your Alina cosplays, and I found that really beautiful because it just, it was totally a perfect mix of you owning all aspects of yourself and portraying it through this character that you were able to connect with. So would any of you like to talk about what that means to you before we sign off?
For me, I had never let myself wear cheongsam in my later like youth, and I had never let myself wear hanfu because I had not known that that was part of my heritage or my ancestry. So because of like the recent events of like the rise of hate crimes and like me wanting to like connect with my joy about this side of my identity, I looked into like wearing and buying and even making traditional Chinese clothing. And so for me to like learn that Alina was being cast as half Asian and specifically Jessie Mei Li being half Chinese like me, I'm half Malaysian Chinese, ethnically Chinese. I was like, wow, that's amazing. I could maybe like incorporate that. So when I found this amazing blue and gold hanfu, I was so excited because like it was a way for me to celebrate the fact that this character is like me, and bring in part of my heritage and celebrate that. So I'm excited because next week I'm gonna have a blonde wig and like a bunch of hanfu hair pieces, and I'm really excited to shoot that. Yeah.
Well, my outline didn't arrive yet, but I'm super excited to have it and to be able to cosplay Alina with my traditional Vietnamese garments. I have to say thanks to Mayan and thanks to Rosa, who both did amazing version of Alina in Hanfu. I thought it was such a good concept, and then I thought maybe I should try that with my Vietnamese garment, because it would be such a meaningful thing for me to wear my traditional garments, something I haven't worn for years and that I've dreaded doing because of many hurtful comments I had in the past, and very recently I had about me wearing out thigh, even though I don't look enough apparently, and made me feel like I do not deserve to wear something so beautiful. But seeing Mayan reclaiming her heritage and going through this whole journey of exploration and discovery about her heritage, like it really sparked something in me, and I realized this is dumb. Why am I pushing away that part of me when this is me? I'm plenty enough to claim my outai and to claim that I can wear outai and cosplay Alina, who is such a powerful, strong character. And I really hope I can channel that once I have everything together and I can cosplay Alina in my Vietnamese version. And I'm really wanting to do that with other characters. Especially, I'm thinking about doing something for Namari from Raya in a a red and gold owl dye to remind her colors in the show, in the movie. But yeah, I'm super excited. It's almost like a scary thing to do for me, but I'm doing it and I'm super excited.
I was just gonna say to hype up Mayan because her cosplay posts with her Alina Hanfu always make me like literally swoon. Like, and also just to note that Erica here is actually one of the like ringleaders of this whole like cultural dress reclamation movement, and so we love her and we appreciate that so much. So anyway, sorry, just want to do some shout outs because everyone here is amazing.
We're definitely all little sun summoners. Like, you make everything brighter all the time, and I'm so happy that you let me talk to you and share this experience because it's meant a lot to me. And I'm sure it will mean a lot to a bunch of other people. You should check out everybody's Instagram here too. They're all amazing. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
That was super fun.
Thank you.